Hello everyone, in this video we will continue our Django REST framework tutorial by adding endpoints that will allow users to add or delete favorite players. We are also going to learn how to set object and global level permissions so that users won't be able to access and edit the favorite players of other users. We are also going to learn how to set restrictions for anonymous or unauthenticated users. To get started, we are going to have to create relationships between our existing models, that is our user model and player model. A user object can have several player objects, while a player object can belong to several user objects. That's a many-to-many relationship. To create this in Django, we are going to add this relationship in our user model. So in our models, we are going to import the player model. So we'll have the attribute favorite players. So this will have a many-to-many relationship with the player model, and we are going to use the many-to-many field. And here we are going to specify the player model, and we are also going to set the related name. So related name will be equal to fans. So after that's done, we are going to need to make our migrations as we've modified the model. So in our terminal, run the make migrations command. That will make our migrations. After that, run the migrate command. So after making the migrations, we can proceed to create our favorite endpoints. The endpoints will have this structure where when a user navigates to toggle favorite, they'll send a post request with the player ID, and that will add the player to the favorites of the user. If the player already exists, they'll be removed from the favorite. We'll also have the endpoint to list the favorite players of a user. So that endpoint will be list favorites. So when a user navigates to this endpoint, they'll be able to get the player favorites. We can build this in our user view set. So in our user view set, so far this is what we have. Now you want to add the toggle favorite action. You can do that by creating a function. It's just a regular function. This function will take self, request, and also the primary key, which will be set to none. So for now I'm going to pass because we need to decorate this function with a decorator from the REST framework. So you can just import it. So from REST framework dot decorators import action, then you can decorate our function. So at action, here we are going to specify a couple of parameters. One is detail. We are going to set it to true, and also the methods. For now we are just going to have post. We have to set detail to true to enable us to be able to pass the public ID in the URL. So with that, we can start building our endpoint. We're going to have the player ID, which will get from the request object in form of a post request. So request dot data dot get. We're also going to need the user object. So user will be equal to self dot get object. We are simply running this function, which will return our user object. So after that, we are going to retrieve our player object from the player model. So player, but we first need to import the player model. So we are going to import that. So that's from import player. So you can proceed to retrieve the player object. That's player dot objects dot get ID, which will be equals to player ID. In some cases the player might not exist, so you can have this in a try block. So try except player dot does not exist. Then we're going to return a message, which will be response. There we can pass our message. You can just say error player does not exist. We can also return our status code. We are going to return a 44. But we should only proceed with this if the player ID has been provided. So we can have this in a if block. So if player ID, continue with this. So now that we have our player objects, we can proceed to check if our user has favorited them or not. We can have this in an if block. So if user dot favorite players dot filter we'll have the ID, which will be equals to player ID. Then use the exists function to check if the player object exists. Dot exists. So if this condition is true, we are going to remove the player object. So user dot favorite players dot remove, and we are going to remove the player. So the next step is to save our user object. So user dot save. So after saving our user, we need to return some kind of response. We're going to return some kind of message stating that we have removed the player and a bit of the player data. So we can have that in our response object message, and this should say removed from favorites. Then we're also going to pass some player data. For now, let's leave it as empty before we process it. So we are going to have the player data. Then we need to serialize our player object, because in its current state it's in form of Django models. So we need to serialize it into JSON. And since it's a player object, we are going to use the player serializer. So we can just import it, and that's from API.serializers.players import player serializer. So we can proceed to serialize our player object. So player serializer. Here we're going to pass our player object, player, and specify that we want the data. Then in our player data, just return the player data. So this is the condition if the user has favorited the player. So if the user hasn't favorited the player, we are going to make them favorites. So else we are going to say user.favoritePlayers.add, and we're going to add our player object. Then we'll save it, user.save. Then again the player data. So you can just copy that, then return our response. So I'm just going to copy this for now, because it's going to be very similar. So the message will be added to favorites, player data. Then we should also return some kind of response. I'm going to return a 200 response. We're going to do the same for the above, which was removed from favorites. Let's start with this one. Status is equals to status dot http 200. So you can just copy this and paste it up there, and there we have it. So this should work. But what if the player ID hasn't been provided? I made a mistake here. This should have been player ID instead of public ID. So here we're going to have player ID request.data.get player ID. So what if the player ID hasn't been provided? So else we are going to return some kind of message. So let's copy our response. I'm going to return an error message. So we are going to say error please provide a valid player ID. Then we are going to return a 400 response. So http 400 bad request. And with that our toggle favorite action is ready. So we just need to write the list favorite action. So I'm going to bring that down and write the action to list our favorite players. So I'm going to copy this. It's going to be very similar to this. Detail will be true, The method will not be paused, so we're going to leave that as empty for now. Then def, this is going to take self, request, and primary key, which is none. Again, we're going to need our user object. Then we're going to return the favorites. So favorites, this will be equal to user.favoritePlayers.all, and that should return all the favorite players of our user. Then again, we are going to need to serialize our player objects, because this will be player objects. We are going to use the player serializer again. So serializer will be equals to player serializer. We're going to pass the favorites, and see the favorites will be a list. We need to pass the many true parameter. So we'll have our response, which will carry our serializer data. So serializer.data. And without our actions are ready, we can test this in our API client. I'm using Insomnia. You can either use Insomnia or Postman, or whichever API client you prefer. So let's just run our servers. So we are going to have the endpoint to list the favorites and the endpoint to toggle favorites. Let's first inspect our user endpoints to get our user objects. So we can send this, and this will return our user objects. I'm going to use my regular object, my regular user, which is not a super user, which is Alice. Let me just copy this, and let us list her favorite players. So we can go to that endpoint. So here we have it. You can just copy that in. At the moment, she doesn't have any favorite players. It's an empty list. So let's add some favorites. So here we can again pass our key, our public ID. So then in our JSON data, here we're going to pass the player ID. You can get a player ID from the player's endpoint. I'm going to copy Helen's ID. So I'm going to paste that in. But at the moment as it is, if we try to send the post request, it won't work, because we'll get this error. Method post not allowed. That is because in our endpoint, where we specified our HTTP method names, we didn't specify a post. So we can just add that, and that should be post. So we can try that. Yeah, and we get a valid response, message added to favorite, and we can list the player data. Again, in our list favorites, we can try that again. We get the player data. If we go to the same endpoint with the same player ID, we get removed from favorites. If we list, we shouldn't get any. Should return an empty list. So that's working correctly. So let me just add that favorite. So far so good. Everything is working correctly. As our application is at the moment, any user can add favorite players and modify the favorite players of another user. You can try that on your end. But for now, I'm going to create object and global permissions that will first check if the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, it will also check if the object belongs to the user. So is the user trying to modify their favorite player objects? If that is true, then they can proceed. If not, it should return an error. So you can proceed to do this. In the previous tutorial, we saw the workings of the is authenticated permission when we created the protected and public views. But that won't work for our use case, because for us we need to check if the user is authenticated and if they own the object. So we are going to have to create a custom permission for that. So in our API application, create a new file. We're going to call it permissions. And here we can create our custom permissions. It's going to be a class, and it's going to extend base permissions from the REST framework. We can import the permissions module from REST framework, then proceed to create our class. I'm going to call it user permissions, and this should extend base permissions from permissions. So permissions dot base permission. So there are two kinds of permissions. One is at the object level, which will regulate our endpoint at the object level. So that's the object permission. And we also have the view permissions, which will be responsible for regulating the overview endpoint. That will be this. So we can start by customizing the object permission to take self, request, view, and object. So the first thing you're going to check is if the request is a safe request. Those are the get requests or options or head. So if request.method, if it's in permissions.safe methods, we are going to return true. So the next thing you're going to check if the object belongs to the requesting user and the user is authenticated. So we can do that using a boolean, and we can have request.user is authenticated, and this will return true if our user is authenticated. And we are going to check if the object belongs to the requesting user. So object is equals to request.user. So this boolean will return true or false, and we want to return this. So if it returns false, the requesting user will not be granted access to the permissions. They'll only be allowed to run safe methods. So that's ready. Now let's look at our overall view permission. So that's under has permission. At this level, you just want to check if the user is authenticated or not. We also don't want to lock out our unauthenticated users, but we can just allow them to make the safe requests. So we can check if the user is anonymous. So if request.user.is anonymous, this will check if our user is anonymous or not. This means that the user is unauthenticated. So if the user is anonymous or unauthenticated, we are going to allow them to make safe methods. So return, we check if they're making a safe request. So that's permissions.safe methods. Otherwise, you are going to give them access if they are authenticated. So request.user.is authenticated. The only thing I think I haven't mentioned is about the view parameter. This is used to check the base name. By the base name, I mean the base name we set in our routes, which are these. So for example, in this case, in our permissions, we can check if the view is users. So we can check if view.basename is equals to users. The view.basename is equals to users, you can just continue with this. In other cases, if you want to use this in multiple views, you can use a list. So in, and here we can have a list of the views. So with that, our permissions are ready. We can now import them in our view set. So we are going to specify the permissions classes is equals to, it's usually a list, so we just need to import our permissions. So from API.permissions, import user permissions, and we can pass it in our lists. So we are almost done. There's just one more thing we need to do, and that is at the object level. So at this function, at our get object function, we need to check for our permissions. So I'm going to run that function, self.check object permissions. This will take the request and our user object. So self.request object will be equals to user. This will be our request. For clarity, we can I just like to pass these parameters for clarity. And with that, we can proceed to test our endpoints. We can start with the user's endpoint. It works well. Now let's check our favorite endpoint. You can try to make a player favorite. Let me get the ID of Saka. Let me copy the player ID and go to our favorite endpoint and try to make them favorites for this user. We are getting an unauthorized error. Authentication credentials were not provided. So we can try logging in our login endpoint, which we created in our previous tutorial. That will return our refresh and access token. Let me just copy the refresh token for now and paste it in our refresh endpoint, and this should return our access token that we can use in our endpoint. So in our favorite endpoint, let's pass the bearer token. Let me remove this one first and try to toggle the favorite. I'm getting an error. You don't have permissions to perform this action. I'm sure my permission levels are accurate. Let me just inspect them. And I think the error is here. I misspelled this. So this should be authenticated. And I can try to run this again. I'm getting an error. You do not have permissions to perform this action. I think the error is in my permissions file. And just looking straight at it, I think the error is here. We did not return this. So I should return this. If this request fails, then the object permission fails. So we can run that again. And yeah, we get it. We see Bukayo Saka has been added to our favorite players. Let's try to list the favorite players on this endpoint. So list, and yeah, we have them. Bukayo Saka and Erling Haaland. What if a user tries to modify the favorite players of another user? Let's log in with my other account, which is byron@gmail.com. Send it. Let me copy the access request, the access token, and try to modify it. And yeah, it's working correctly. You can see you are getting an error. You don't have permissions to perform these actions. I think that's it for this tutorial. We've seen how you can create these custom actions, the toggle favorite and the list favorites. You've also seen how you can create custom permissions. In the coming tutorial, we are going to improve our application. We're going to learn about automated workflows using Celery and Redis. You've seen this in real-world applications where there is automated email sending. For example, in our use case, we want to update the user data every week because football is played every week. So we want to do this, and we don't want to do this manually. So a solution to this is to create an automated workflow. And in Django, you can do this using Celery and Redis. This is an important skill that you will do well to learn. So we are going to look at that in our next tutorial. But for now, if you found this video useful, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for similar content. Thank you for watching.